Hi there, welcome back to the Flask Mastery series. I'm Gorret Golden, and in this session we are going to be implementing the authentication process where we are going to handle the user registration. So let's get started. So with the authentication process, we verify the user identity through using credentials like the email address and the password, or the user phone number and the password. So authentication involves processes like user registration, where we create a new user account. And on the other hand, it also involves user login, where the registered users now have the ability of logging into an application using the credentials that they used for the user registration. So for this case, we always work with the authentication process in terms of logging in a user in a way that, for example, if we are using the email address and the user phone number, they must always be unique. And that is always a constraint that we pass on the database. So for us to be able to implement the authentication process, we are going to go ahead and work on the controllers, which are going to act as actions or functions that we are going to use to perform the process of user registration for our API. So in the auth subfolder that is stored within the controllers folder, we are going to go ahead and create a new file for the auth controller. So I'll go ahead and name the file as authcontroller.python. And this file is actually going to store all the functions that are going to be used to perform the different authentication process of user registration, login and logging out. So the endpoints that we are going to work with for the authentication process, we have auth/register, auth/login, then auth/logout. So we can pretty see that for each URL or the endpoint, we are having a prefix of the auth. So what this means is that we are going to go ahead and work with the blueprints in a way that we are grouping our endpoints together. So you can actually check out the Flask palettes under the modular applications with blueprints. You can read furthermore about the blueprints. But for this case, we are going to be working with them in a way that they group our endpoints together. So blueprints are part of Flask, and the first thing we do is to import the blueprint class. So from Flask, we import the blueprint, and since this is a class, we have to go ahead and create a new object. So I'll go ahead and copy this and paste it here. So we are going to go ahead and rename this to auth, and then the name we want to work with for grouping the blueprints is going to be auth still. Now with the fact that we are not working with the views, I'm going to go ahead and update this. Instead, we can actually pass in the URL prefix, and for this case we can work with API/version1 as the first version of our API, and the endpoints that are going to be grouped under the auth blueprint is going to be. So now we are going to go ahead and start implementing the user registration logic. So user registration. So we know that we are working with controllers that use functions to perform a particular tasks, whereby they work with routes in a way that they are handling the incoming requests. And if the incoming request URL matches any URL that we are having within this file, it is going to go ahead and call that file, and the task will be implemented. So for this case, I will define function and can call it register user, and I'll first of all return the pass keyword as of now. Since this function is going to act as a controller, we need to work with the route decorators. So with the fact that we are using a blueprint, the decorator must point to our blueprint. So at auth.route, and always the first parameter we pass in is the URL with which you want to work. So we said that for this case, we are going to use register as the name of the URL. So I'll pass in this /register. We are working with user registration where we have to create a new user. So we need the methods parameter. And for this case, since we are creating a new user, we have to pass in a post as the HTTP method. So the methods parameter is always a list taking in the different HTTP methods that we are going to work with for this URL. So now let's embark on the registration process. So we work with the request response cycle in a way that a user makes a request to the application and we return a particular response. So for this case, we have to work with a variable, for example, that is going to store the incoming requests from the user. So I'll say data will be request. And in terms of Flask, it works with the request object to be able to handle all the incoming requests. So request.json, since we are working with the REST API, we are going to be working with the JSON data as the content type. So the first step is that we always keep track of the incoming request. And for this case, we know that if we are creating a new user, we have our attributes that were defined on the user model. We have the first name, the last name, the email, the contact, the image which is nullable, the password, biography if the user type is an author, the user type and the default one is an author, and then the timestamps too. So for now, we have to actually work with the incoming requests in a way that we create variables that are going to store, for example, the first name. So we shall access our data variable. Then we get the key for the first name. Since we are working with JSON, which is always a dictionary, we now work with the get method and we pass in the key that is going to come from the incoming request. We also need the last name. So update this to last name. Then we have the contact, we have the email, then we have the user type. This can be type. Then we also need to store the user password. We also need to cater for the biography. The biography is only going to be mandatory if the user type is an author. So if the user type is an author, we shall make the biography required, but cases whereby the user type is, for example, an admin, we are going to make the biography to be null. So with the fact that we are working with a database, we have to ensure that we are not having redundant data in terms of duplicate values, or for example, having authors with the same email addresses or the same numbers, and also cases whereby we are having empty data within the database. So first of all, we shall ensure that all the required attributes on our model are being submitted within the request. So I'll therefore work with an if statement and check for null values from the request. So if not, the first name, or not the last name, or not the contact, or not the password, or not the email. So I'll also import JSONify from Flask such that we return a JSONified response to the user. So JSONify. Then we want to return a dictionary with a key as an error. So error. Then return the message. All fields are required. So this is going to be a bad request. So for this response, we shall now also have to return a status code. And for this case, we know that we are having our status codes. So I'll go ahead and import the status codes because they're within our package. So from app.status codes, we import the status code of 400, which is a bad request from the user or from the client. So I'll check out the one of HTTP 400 bad request, such that we also return the status code. Not forgetting that these are the validations of the data, or the validations of the request, of the incoming request. So the second validation that we want to work with is for a case where the user type we are trying to create is an author. So if the type and the variable we are referring to is this that we have defined, so if the type value is that of an author, we want to go ahead and make sure that the biography is also submitted. So if the type is an author and we do not have the biography, then we shall go ahead and return a response. So I'll copy this and reuse it here and update the message to enter your author biography. Enter your author biography. And then the status code for this case can also work with the bad request. So the other validation you want to ensure is going to work with the password. So we can go ahead and ensure that all the passwords are greater or equal to 8 characters. So since we are checking out for the length of the password, we are going to use the len method, and we pass in the variable that is coming from the request, which is the password, and we ensure that if the length of the password is less than 8 characters, then you want to go ahead and tell the user, we want to go ahead and return a response that the password is too short. And we also need to validate the email address, and for this case we can actually work with the validators package. So I'll go ahead and install the validators, pip install validators, such that we work with this package in a way that it validates our email address from the incoming request. So once it has been installed, the first thing we want to do is to go ahead and import it. So import validators, and for us to ensure that the email address is the valid one from the request, we want to check if not the validators, then dot the email, because this library has the email function that we can use to pass in a particular email that we want to validate. So for this case, we are now supposed to pass in the email that is coming from the request, and it's this variable. So we shall return a response, and I'll just actually copy this return statement and paste it here. So the message for this case is going to be email is not valid. Still with the validation of the request data, we have to cater for the constraints. So for now, we know that the email address and the user phone number must be unique. So we have to make a query to the database and first of all ensure that there isn't any other email address that is the same as the one in the incoming request. So in case it exists, we have to return a message that tells the user that, for example, the email address is in use or the phone number is already in use. So the way we make such queries to the database, since we are working with Flask SQL Alchemy, our object relational mapper, we make a query to our model, which is the user model for this case. And first of all, we shall import it from our package. So from app.models, then .users, we import the user model. So user.query.filter by. So the filter by method expects a parameter of the value that we have to filter against. So the name for this case, we have to pass in the email, and this value is the name that has been defined on our database. So for your case, if you actually worked with an attribute as email address, it should be the email address. But on my model, I actually have the email attribute, not the email address. So in case you worked with the email address attribute, that is what must be reused here. So the value it expects, it has to make a query on the incoming variable, which is what we have defined here. And we always make sure that we are making the query against the first row, or the first record is not none. So this condition checks out for records that match the incoming request in terms of the email address. So if there is one that exists, then that means that we have to go ahead and return a response that the email address is already in use. So email address in use, and then the status code for this case is always a conflict. So I'll also make sure that we are importing 409 status code. So HTTP 409. Do we really have it? So I will ensure that we have the status code too for consistency within our status codes file. So for this case, we shall now go ahead and update this to 409. And of course, making sure that we are first of all importing it here and reusing it. So we are now going to reuse the same logic for our contact to ensure that we are not having users being created with the same phone numbers. So that constraint must be unique, and I'll just go ahead and update this to contact. So on your model, if you actually used phone number instead of the contact, that means that this should be phone number, and then the value should be the variable that you have defined here for the contact. So having worked on the validation of the incoming requests, we now have to go ahead and work on the logic that stores the new user to the database. So I'll first of all make sure that we are working with the error handling such that we use a try and except block. So try except, so that we can easily catch any errors that arise during the process of creating a new user. So except with the exception class, and we can reuse this as E for the error. And for this case, we want to go ahead and first of all ensure that for any errors that arise during the process of creating the user, we are rolling back the database. In other words, we are undoing any step. So I'll make sure that I'm importing our DB object from the extensions. So from app.extensions, we import the DB object, db.session.rollback. And having rolled back, we want to also return a response of the error that we are having at hand so that we can quickly fix it up. So the first thing we do is to ensure that we are casting our error. So I'll use the string constructor and I pass in the variable E that we are working with. And for this case, the status code is always an internal server error. So I'll also ensure that we have the internal server error status code being imported. This. So I'll copy it here and then ensure that I'm pasting it and reusing it here. So within the try block, we are now going to go ahead and add the logic that stores a user to the database. So for this case, we need a new instance on our user model class. So I can go ahead and define a variable new user and I instantiate it on our class user. And since we are working with the constructor can give us insights of the attributes that have been defined on the user model or the user class. So we need the first name, and the first name is going to be substituted with the value that is coming from the request. Same applies to the last name. Then we also need the password. So now for the password, we actually want to ensure security in a way that we are encrypting the passwords by hashing them. So for this case, we actually have to go ahead and work with the third-party library that is going to hash our passwords. So we are going to work with bcrypt, which is an extension that provides the hashing utilities for the application. So first and foremost, we shall ensure that we are installing Flask bcrypt. And once it has been installed, according to the documentation, we always have to create a new object. So we shall import this statement and we need to create a new object of bcrypt. So bcrypt, we instantiate it on the bcrypt class, and therefore we shall also import, first of all, clear this up. So we import the bcrypt object from the extensions file too, such that we can work with that object according to the documentation, because it says that, so for us to be able to hash the passwords, bcrypt works with the generate password hash function. So I'm going to copy this up so I can actually create a variable here, hashed password, such that it stores the password that has been hashed. So for example, if a user enters their password as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, we want to convert the password into different symbols and strings or numbers that other people who access the database cannot understand. That is more like encryption of it. In other words, the hashing part of it. So bcrypt generates password hash. Instead of us working with this value that has been added statically, we want to go ahead and pass in our password that is coming from the incoming request. So while creating the user, we now have to go ahead and pass in our hashed password. So hashed password, and we also need to store the user email address, and then the email is going to be the email from the incoming request. So we also need to store the user contact. So contact will also be equal to the contact from the incoming request. And then we also need the biography. It is going to be equal to the biography. And also we need the user type. So according to the Flask SQL Alchemy docs, we can see that for us to be able to store the new user object, we have to first of all add that object to the session and then commit. So this is what we are going to do for this case. So I'll paste this here and update the indentation. So db.session.add. So we add our new user variable and then we commit. So I'll actually update this to creating the user and this to hashing the password. So having created our new user, we have to go ahead and return a response to the user. So we shall return a JSONified response. So JSONify we are going to return a message that is going to be customized. For example, we can say Gorret Golden has been successfully created as an author or as an admin. So that means that we need to keep track of the username for each new user that has been created. So I'll actually go ahead and define a variable here that keeps track of the username. So I'll say username will be assigned to our new user variable, and we know that this variable is an object of the user class. That means that it has access to the get full name, where we are trying to concatenate the user's last name and the first name. So I'll go ahead and copy this method such that we use it with our object. So get full name, and now we shall update the message value to username, and we concatenate this with has been successfully created as an. So we now have to concatenate our string literal with the user type. So for us to make it dynamic, we now have to pass in the user type of each user. So new user dot the user type. Then we need to add a comma so that we can also return a user object to the response. So user is now going to be a dictionary having the first name for the user, and for this case I will access the new user object. Then we have the attribute for the first name, then comma. I'll copy this such that we'll use it for the other attributes. So we shall also go ahead and ensure that we are passing in the ID for each user. So new user dot the ID. So on our return statement, we are now also going to go ahead and ensure that we are returning a status code. So whenever we create a new resource to our database, the status code is a 201. So I will also ensure that we are importing the 201 status code. Now we are going to go ahead and test our logic. So by this I will ensure that our application is running. So we are going to use Postman to test our endpoints. So you can actually check out the Postman official documentation and ensure that you install it in case you do not have the software installed on your local machine. So first things first, I'm going to ensure that we have a collection for our API, and then I'll rename it as Authors API. And within our collection, I'm going to go ahead and ensure that we have different folders for each blueprint. So this is going to be the auth folder, and within the auth folder we shall go ahead and add a new request, and the name of this request is going to be just a user. So for the URL, I'll ensure that we are copying this up and we paste it here. Then the prefix we are working with for our API is API version 1. Then the endpoint to which we have to make the request is going to be auth/register for this case. So this is the prefix to which we are working with, and the final endpoint we are using is this /register. Since we are creating a new user, we have to first of all update the method to a post, and if we are to work with the post method, it expects a body from the request. So the body, and for this case we are using Grow, and we are working with the JSON data. So I'll go ahead and create a dictionary here, or a JSON object, And for this case, we know that we need to work with the first name, and then the value can be Daphne Nabatanzi. So when we make the request, we can see that we are getting a response of the request URL was not found on the server, and then the status code is not found. So that means that we have to go ahead and ensure that we are registering our blueprint within our application factory function. So first, to achieve this, I'll add a comment here, and I call it registering blueprints. Whenever we work with the blueprints, we have to ensure that we are registering them. So I'll copy this and paste it here. And for this case, we want to ensure that we are registering our auth blueprint. So I'll make sure that we are importing from app.thecontrollers, then .auth. Then within our auth controller, we want to import this auth object that we have created on the blueprint class. So import auth, and then shall go ahead and update this to auth as the name for the blueprint that we want to register. So having updated that, we are now getting a value error that the URL must start with a slash, and this is true with the fact that we passed in the URL prefix. All URLs must start with a slash. So when we run the application, we are now going to go ahead and retest our endpoint by making a new request. So we see that when we send a new request, the response we are getting is that all fields are required, meaning that we have to ensure that we are passing in all the required fields in the request body. So I'm going to go ahead and update this very fast. And then the response we are having is all fields are required. So that means that there is an issue that we are having with our implementation. So if not first name or, okay, so my bad. So if not first name or not last name, or not the contact, or not the password, or not the email. So we had forgotten to add the not keyword. So I'm going to send the request once again. The response we are getting, we have the message. Nabatanzi Daphne has been successfully created as an author. So we can see that we are concatenating the user's last name and the first name, and we are also passing in the user type. Okay, so looks like we are not creating or keeping track of the biograph. If the user type in data, then else we just return a default value for the user type as an author for this case. So I'll go ahead and run the application and try to make a new request. And I think before we also make the request, I can pretty see that we have to update to return a better response for this. So email address already in use, and same applies for the contact. I'm going to go ahead and make a new request. So we can see that we are getting a status code of 201, meaning that our user has been successfully created, and the message we are getting for this response is that Nabatanzi Daphne has been successfully created as an author. And then we are keeping track of the biography, then the contact, the created at, the email, the first name, last name, and the type. So for now, we can actually update this to Doreen, and the last name to maybe Namakula. You can see that contact already in use. So when I update the contact and make a new request, it actually creates the user. And for now, we are also going to finalize this by creating a new user who is an admin. So for this case, if we are creating an admin, we have to go ahead and pass in the key for the type, for the user type actually. So user type, and then the type is going to be admin. So instead of the first name being Doreen, you can update this to admin, and then we update this to system, and then the email address is going to be admin@gmail.com, and then the name can be updated to this, and the password can remain the same for now. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new request. So we can see that we get a response that the system admin has been created successfully. Looks like we actually did not update this. So if type in data else author. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and maybe update this to admin, system admin, then the email address, I can update this to systemadmin@gmail.com, and then the phone number, we can change this to 10, and then the type is going to be an admin. Then when I make a request, we are forgetting to update the type, so I'll update this too, and then when I make a request, we can see that the response is system admin has been successfully created as an admin. So that is all for the user registration. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next session, where we shall work on the authentication process in a way that we are logging in the newly created user. Thanks for watching.